All right. Can everyone see and hear everything all right?
Yes.
All right.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. I'm very sorry about him. So our project was we wanted to create first a new tagging system to replace the type of case field. We'd mentioned this a bit in our previous presentations, but it was so inconsistent. And as of our last presentation, we had already narrowed it down a bit. But we ran it through OpenRefine again this time, which we'll get into more in a second, to make them even more uniform. And we also analyzed the data to see if there was any kind of relationship between time and when cases were more frequent. And the tools that we ended up actually using for this were OpenRefine SPSS, which is for data analysis, and Excel.
So we actually had another plan initially. We had planned to make a finding aid in archive space, and we had a bit of a time with that. So neither of us had archive space installed on our computers. It's a server-based software, which is notoriously a little extra difficult to install. Not only do we need to install the archive space server, but also we needed a few other tools. We needed Java, but not the most recent version of Java. That would be too easy. We needed a little bit of an older one. We also needed Solr and MySQL. And we kept running into a number of problems on both of our laptops, actually. And we reached out for support from the library, and I also got connected with Greg Jansen, who's a software expert, and we had some communications back and forth of trying to troubleshoot. And ultimately, it came to be, it took too long. So we decided to move on. But it was actually, I would say for both of us, a really good learning experience. We've talked a lot about agile processes this semester. And I think part of that is also understanding when you're not getting anywhere with a given tool. And so it was an important decision for us to make to conserve some of our initial idea, but also pivot as well. And I think what we were able to build out of that is still very interesting and speaks to our goals that we had going in. So one of the things that thankfully we had already done before we decided whether or not we were going to use archive space is we had already started the process of creating what we're calling a tagging system. Something that we've recognized throughout the semester and a lot of groups have is that there was some standardization of the ways that cases were described in those case type and case classification columns, but not fully. There were obviously things like typos or misspelled words. There were also cases that were called other case, and then there was more clarification in the case classification column. So there wasn't a single category into which each case sort of neatly fell into. And so we thought that that was sort of a problem for analysis. If we had all of these 86, I believe, categories that you see on the screen right now, so much harder to do analysis with those, especially since a lot of them are so similar to one another. What is really the difference between other reports and miscellaneous reports? And so we began the process of beginning to combine and narrow down those categories. And the first step was using a new tool for us, which was OpenRefine. And so we were able to plug all of our values from our metadata spreadsheet into that. And then we were able to clean that data. So that eliminated things like typos pretty quickly. And it combined things that were similar. The letters in them essentially were similar. So loss and lost, it would help us combine those. And so that helped us to create 51 categories. So we were able to eliminate around 30 values just from using OpenRefine. But since it couldn't recognize the meaning of things, we then went through manually on the spreadsheet and we had to combine other categories. And so that resulted in far fewer categories. But one of the things that we noticed was that a huge number of cases, one of the largest ones, were other records. And so we felt that that wasn't sufficient to explain what was in those records, which was often very diverse. They didn't necessarily have anything in common with one another. And they also held some of our most important and our biggest cases. So we created some new categories when we were analyzing those other cases. The first of which was resistance and surveillance. That was created to essentially describe cases in which the police in the camp were engaging in surveillance of incarcerees and cases in which incarcerees were using their agency to challenge camp rules. And so that was one of our new categories. We also created two labels that had to do with movement inside and outside of the camp. These were only a few cases, but it felt necessary to distinguish them and pull them out from the other cases. So movements within camp that had to do with things like whether or not people were violating curfew, if they had the appropriate passes, things like that. And movements between camps, that's things like transfers, which, as we'll talk about a little bit later, Tule Lake during the time period which our box covers received a lot of transfers from other camps, and many individuals were moved outside of Tule Lake during that period. And then other is still a great category for things that are hard to classify. So we still had about 6.6% of our cases that didn't have relationships essentially with any of our other cases that still ended up in that other basket. So what we ended up with were these categories, and it just became a lot neater and easier to analyze. We also combined lost and found with lost and found, and because we felt that those were similar. Another aspect of this reclassification system is the idea of doing this as reparative description. So this idea that the SAA, the Society of American Archivists, defines reparative description as the remediation of practices or data that exclude, silence, harm, or mischaracterize marginalized people in the data created or used by archivists. So a lot of what we've talked about this semester and a lot of what other groups have talked about is the power of the language used to describe people who were incarcerated. And so we wanted our case tagging to represent a more justice-oriented vision of how we want to deal with this data. So something like resistance and surveillance does that in its own way. We also had some cases where the police had tagged them as quote unquote mental cases or insanity, and felt that that was not how we wanted to present our data. So that was changed to mental illness in our own categorization system. And so the last little piece on this essentially is that we wanted to create these more uniform categories because then they're more useful for analysis. We have sort of a controlled vocabulary essentially with which we can talk about and analyze these cases, which Jocelyn will touch on.
So I used a program called SPSS to do this, which unfortunately is not very accessible. It's something like $100 a month for individual use. But luckily I was able to get it for free on my work computer. So I just stayed late and did it on there because it was the only place on campus I could really access it. But it's something that I used a lot in undergrad and thought might be helpful for this. The thing that you saw briefly pop up there isn't something you really need to worry about. It was just an example of the kind of raw output that SPSS produces. And from that, I was mostly looking to see if there was any kind of statistical significance in how many cases were occurring at different time periods, which, if you're unfamiliar, mostly means that statistical significance is mostly the concept that the changes in the data that you're seeing would be explained by something other than normal variance across time. And unfortunately, we weren't able to make any statistically significant conclusions, which was mostly because there is overlap in the boxes. So the cases that started with A, the cases that started with LF, and the cases that started with T were all grouped in different time periods. which meant that some of those overlapped with others. So we can't make any definite conclusions, but we were still able to see some patterns emerge. And just because they aren't statistically significant doesn't mean that they aren't of value to us. So this is the cases per day, which it's kind of a lot, which is why we also break it down more in a minute. But if you look, you can see that there are spikes around June 1943 and then around January and February of 1944. And when you remove the lost and found cases, you definitely see a drop happen, which shows that a lot of our cases were from the lost and found category, but those big spikes still actually stay roughly the same. If you can advance one. And then this is in 2-week periods. So I just took all of the data. I found a calendar from 1943 and 1944 and grouped everything so that it would go from Sunday of one week to Saturday of the next. And looked at those because I thought that the cases per day graph was very overwhelming and wasn't ultimately that indicative of what was going on. But this shows that there was the biggest spike right around early to mid-January of 1944. We looked into that why, which we'll get to in a bit, but most of the bigger spikes flattened out as soon as we excluded lost and found. So it looks like that was most of what was skewing the data to make it appear that there were a lot more in 1943 than there actually were. And if you can advance one more. And then we also just looked per month, which pretty much confirmed that there is still like a little bump in June 1943 and October 1943, but really the only big spike is in January. That's the only massive difference that was made once you take out the lost and found cases. So probably the reason for those first two spikes came down to just the sheer number of lost and found cases that we had in this box.
And so we also put together a graph of this is the bi-weekly with no lost and found data that you saw a little bit earlier, but superimposed on that is a very simple timeline of some major events that happened during the time span through which our boxes ranged. This was just created in Excel, though I think that there may be visualization tools that would create a really engaging example of this data as well. We just didn't have time and I didn't necessarily know where to look for that. But you can see over in July, that is when Tule Lake was named a segregation center. We don't really see any major movements in our number of cases around then. One of the interesting things that you can see a little bit later in October of 43, over the course of the month, strikes and labor agitations developed over after an incident in which a farm worker was killed in an accident. We actually did have the police report from that in our boxes. It was labeled a traffic case just because it was a car accident. But it's interesting that a traffic case caused so much tumult in the camp at that time. And it is an interesting sign for us to look in unexpected places for information. You can also see there was a lot of unrest around the beginning of November. The WRA national director visited Tule Lake, and this is sort of called the November incident. It's a series of quite a bit of unrest and then very immediate and quite harsh repression that resulted later in martial law being declared between November of that year until January of the next. And then mid-January, martial law was lifted. And I think this is a really interesting point because right after martial law is lifted, we do see that pretty noticeable January spike, a spike which begins around the middle of that month. Like we said, we can't really prove anything, but by comparing these two data points, both the historical data and then also the statistical data that Jocelyn put together, we can sort of create hypotheses about why that may be. And so one of the things that we thought might be a possibility, we see that in the resistance and surveillance cases category that we created, there was 90% of those things that we called resistance and surveillance happened after the the martial law was lifted. So from that, we can hypothesize that potentially during the period of martial law, that the military was dealing with a lot of the things that the police now, after martial law is lifted, are dealing with. Not to mention there might be a little bit more sort of surveillance after you've had this tumultuous period in Tule Lake. So I think overall, our big takeaways from doing this project has been the importance of flexibility, of being able to pivot and change paths when needed while still pursuing things that I think both of us were really interested in and felt really engaged with throughout our time in the box.
Yeah, so that's brilliant, and